thing.
In 1875, the Bulldog Club defined the perfect British bulldog in a booklet that was circulated to breeders everywhere. From dogs to engineering, from sport to space and time, the world was becoming obsessed by standards and the rules that define them. This was the world of the Victorians. I'm not quite old enough to have been a Victorian, but 40 years ago I was a scruffy schoolboy, and the school I came to was this one, Eton College, one of the oldest schools in the country. In the Victorian era, on the playing fields of schools like Eton, Harrow and Rugby, some of the world's most enduring rules evolved. Take football. In the early 19th century, football had no rules, so schoolboys made up their own. And some pretty extraordinary games emerged. Just have a look at this. This is the Eton Wall game. It's one of the oldest forms of football that's still played in the world. And you can see that they use just the stuff that was lying around. This wall, built in 1717, it's one side of the pitch, and it's also a grandstand for the spectators. And the goals, a door, and a tree. Oh, that looks painful. I never got to play this game. Is it easy?
It's hard work. It's very hard work. I mean,
what about the rules?
The rules, they're quite complicated. Come inside, you!
Let this guy out! Do people get injured in there?
Not seriously. I mean, there's no momentum involved in the contact, so it's just pushing, no punching. So.
But that wall looks kind of rough.
Yeah, you get a few scrapes, but it's not too bad.
In the seconds, Eddie, in the seconds!
If this looks like chaos, that's because it is. The rules are so complicated and open to interpretation that punch-ups used to be commonplace. And a goal hasn't been scored since 1909. The wall game's really difficult to play and incredibly boring to watch, because you can't see the ball and nobody knows what's going on. However, in 1863, a whole bunch of old boys from public schools decided life was too complicated like this. They got together, formed an association in order to invent rules for football. They called it association football, and because it's got a sock in the middle, they abbreviated it to soccer. Come on up, Idens! Push! Put some welly in it! Get off my foot! Soccer became popular with players and spectators all over Britain. By 1900, there were over 1,000 football teams playing competitive matches by the same set of rules. Some rules were invented just to make the game better to watch, like the offside rule in 1866. The British rules of sport were about to be adopted all over the world. Soccer, rugger, cricket, golf. But croquet was getting rather dull. The Victorians were after a simpler, livelier game, one that could be played on a hot summer's day by both sexes, one that would get the blood moving. In December 1873, there was a grand party at a country house not far from here in North Wales. The guests had hunting, shooting, fishing, feasts, a huge dance. And one of them, a chap called Walter Clopton Wingfield, was so impressed that when he invented a new game, he dedicated it to the people who'd been at that party. He applied for a patent the following year, 1874, and his game came to be called lawn tennis. Croquet was no longer de rigueur.
tennis was all the rage.
Grand Victorian gardens already had the perfect playing surface, thanks to croquet. But lawn tennis was also helped by the development of a newfangled machine that was invented just before Victoria came to the throne.
It was actually invented by a man called Edwin Beard Budding, a mechanical wizard who worked in an ironworks near the cotton mills of Gloucestershire. He was making a machine to shave the nap off the cloth, take off all the little bobbles and make it wonderfully smooth. And he had a brilliant idea. Make a big one and you could shave a lawn. In 1830, the lawnmower made its first cut on the Great British lawn.
The rules that came with Wingfield's tennis kits are quite unlike those of today, and the shape of the court was rather odd.
He'd planned a rectangular court, but in this diagram in the book, he wanted to show the wing nets, and so the perspective's all wrong, and it looks as if the baselines are meant to be longer than the net. Well, when people bought the kits, they actually just looked at this picture, and they paid no attention at all to the written instructions.
As a result, people made their tennis courts to this hourglass shape. The game proved hugely popular. Within a year, Wingfield sold 1,000 nets, complete with all the necessary kit.
Is this how the kit would have arrived?
That's right. This is one of Wingfield's original boxes.
Original?
This is the list of everything that's inside, and
Oh,
the box and all the contents contained inside would have cost the princely sum of 5 guineas.
OK, so tell me what's in. Obviously there's some nets. You
That's
need
right.
a lot of that, don't you?
You do. Rackets. This is one of the original rackets from Wingfield's game. It's got a very, very small head, and then it's slightly twisted.
Bent,
That's
basically.
right.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
OK, and the balls?
Right. Well, that one's
That's
one's
squishy.
solid. That's right. It's made from India rubber, which was invented around about the middle of the 19th century, and it was absolutely essential to Wingfield's game.
Right.
Prior to India rubber being invented, most balls were solid,
Right.
like this one.
Right.
And
Oh,
like
this
this
is
one.
solid. Now that wouldn't bounce, would it? That's
Not on
much
grass,
good
it
use.
wouldn't.
So you needed rubber.
Exactly.
So what you're saying is that without the lawnmower and without rubber, they couldn't have had lawn tennis.
Exactly.
Wingfield's court design and his rules were soon discarded. New ones were devised by the All England Club in 1877, when the first competition was held at Wimbledon, for gentlemen only.
Not bad, this game, is it?
But by 1884, women were competing at Wimbledon, and in 1900, the first overseas competitor from the United States took part.
The success of tennis must have been partly due to the fact that it allowed young Victorian men and women to, cavort and socialise together. Very risque. How thrilling to be able to jump around and get hot and sweaty like this without breaking any of the delicate rules of behaviour.
Rules of behaviour were everything to the growing numbers of rich Victorians who had worked for their money instead of inheriting it. To be accepted in polite society, the nouveau riche needed to adopt the correct customs and practices, especially in public.
The new Victorian wealthy found themselves able to dine out, which meant that their eating, drinking and manners were on display. So they had to learn the new code, because with the new code of dining, it meant they could move up in the world. Hello.
Brown's Hotel opened in 1837, the year Victoria came to the throne. Its founder, James Brown, saw an opportunity for creating a genteel inn, one that had a dining area open to passing members of the public. It was one of the first in London.
In true style of keeping up with the Joneses, the Victorians were desperate to join the upper crust, so they took etiquette to new levels of complexity. Dining out became really quite a tricky business if you wanted to join the right set.
Smart restaurants like the 1837 still lay their tables according to Victorian codes. Everything on the table must be geometrically placed. A precise 2 feet from one place centre to the next defines the allowed elbow room, as determined by Queen Victoria herself. In the 1860s, a new fashion of dining from Russia became popular in London. Each type of food had its own set of implements, and there were rules dictating how one should use them. Sarah Paston Williams knows them all and introduced me to one particular Victorian invention, the fish knife.
It's blunt.
It's blunt.
And it's flat,
so
and it's
because
bent
you
too.
should never cut fish. You divide it like that.
Right.
So you
and
don't
take little
actually cut
pieces.
it, yes.
Right.
And by having this sort of rather weird shape, it's letting everybody know that you're not expected to use it as a knife.
I see.
So this was a wonderful invention.
So
But
that-
of course it was for the middle classes. It was very non-new to use a fish knife. If you were an aristocrat, you would certainly not have had a fish knife and fork.
Oh, really?
And you were showing by laying the table with a fish knife and a fish fork, that you had actually bought your silver rather than inherited it, because it just didn't exist.
There were tongs for sugar, forks for cheese, and squeezers for lemon. Even eating pudding was far from simple.
Pudding. Now this is creme brulee,
Delicious,
right? You're the
yes,
expert.
creme brulee. The Victorians ate as many puddings as they could with a fork, because the spoon, I mean, what a baby eats with a spoon. A spoon's a very easy utensil to handle, and so it wasn't very highly regarded.
Were these rules really made to trip up the unwary?
No, I don't think they were. It was all to just show people that you were very well behaved and that you were in control of yourself.
Am I allowed to hold the thing, or should I?
You can touch the dish, but
I
you
can.
mustn't touch the food. That was the important thing. Your
Right.
fingers were definitely... The only thing that you could have with your fingers was a grape or a cherry, because they've got stones in.
Oh, you could?
You
Okay.
could, yes, but you mustn't eat anything like if you want to say an orange, you avoided an orange like the plague, because you couldn't peel it yourself.
To feel comfortable in public, you had to do the right thing. And if you were in doubt about what the right thing was, you could always refer to Mrs. Beeton.
Mrs. Beeton was the lady who wrote all this huge book, including recipes, but at the back she tells you exactly how to behave for dinner, well, all meals, starting with breakfast. Even at a picnic, she tells you exactly what you should take and how you should behave. It was very important.
So they needed the rules.
They
So
did.
they knew how to eat in
They knew
public.
how to eat if they were invited out. They would know it and not worry about it. They would know exactly how to behave.
Wonderful.
Isabella Beeton began compiling her book on household management in 1857 when she was just 21. It contained over 1,000 pages of recipes and advice on running a home and servants. Although Mrs. Beeton died when she was only 28, her influence upon the Victorian middle classes lived on. This was also a time when it became possible for women to make their mark outside the domestic arena. One Victorian woman was even able to use her work to influence the government.
Kindness, my dear old comrades of Balaclava and Sweden, say to Shaw, Florence Nightingale.
Isn't that amazing? That was actually Florence Nightingale herself in 1890, thanking all the nurses and the soldiers that she'd worked with during the Crimean War. In fact, it was they who had an awful lot to thank her for.
In 1854, Florence Nightingale left England with 38 nurses, bound for the Crimea. British soldiers were fighting the Russians on the shores of the Black Sea, and Florence was spurred into action by reports that the English wounded were dying in their thousands. Florence was faced with row upon row of soldiers, many barely alive, suffering from war wounds, frostbite, typhoid and cholera. They were crammed into filthy wards without sanitation, hot water or proper food. What really shocked her was that only a fraction of the soldiers brought into the hospitals were dying of their wounds. Most were dying of disease.
She wanted to convince the government that the British soldiers who went to hospital were in effect being condemned to death. But she needed proof, and she knew exactly how to get it.
For 2 years, she recorded detailed information about each of the patients and their care. She measured everything, not only the state of the soldiers on admission, how long they stayed, and whether they lived or died, but even the distance between the beds and the temperature of the drinking water. No one had collected information like this before.
Once she'd collected and sorted her information, she wrote a report for the Royal Commission. And in that report, she included a special diagram. It's actually one of the first pie charts, and it tells the whole story. Just look at this. Each of these wedges represents a month. So this is February and this is March. And the area of the wedge indicate the number of men who died. This blue area means disease. They'd all died of disease before a shot was fired. You can see that far more men were dying of disease than dying of wounds. It was absolutely awful. And it wasn't until she was able to bring in sensible measures of hygiene that the death rate came tumbling down. And if you look here, by about July of 1855, you can see that far fewer men are dying of disease. She's reduced the death rate from disease by something like 80%. It was a staggering performance.
Florence Nightingale did two important things. First, her statistics showed that deaths from disease were reduced by simple hygienic measures. Second, her diagram was a brilliant way to show this. By the 1860s, her schemes for improving hospital care were underway.
Florence Nightingale was not only a nurse and a campaigner, but she actually used statistics to change the world, just as her contemporary scientists were seeing patterns in nature everywhere they looked.
Victorians knew that their world was made up of elements, the basic components of nature. In the 1860s, 63 elements were known. Some of these appeared to have magical properties, which they shared with a few others.
The magic was that some of these properties were remarkably similar. Have a look at this. I've got here 3 metals. They're quite soft. I'm going to cut a little bit of this one off. This is sodium. You see, I can cut it quite easily with a knife, and you get a nice, shiny, silvery surface. This one here is lithium, and this is potassium. And I just want to show you what happens when I drop them into water. First, lithium. Well, it fizzes a bit, not terribly exciting. Now, a little bit of sodium. It's molten, running around, being chased by the hydrogen that's being generated. And now, a little bit of potassium, and I'm going to lean well back because this could be vigorous. That was quite something. Now, clearly, those 3 metals share the same property in the way they react with water, though they do it at different rates. Back then, scientists were wrestling with one big question. Were there some other patterns lurking among the elements?
No one quite knew what these patterns might be until 1869, when a Russian scientist, Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, made a breakthrough.
Mendeleev made a set of playing cards with the names of the elements written on them, like this, for example, sodium. And he laid them out row by row like patience cards, trying to establish a pattern in nature. Now, he already knew some of the relationships. He knew, for example, that lithium, sodium, and potassium react very similarly with water. So he took them and he put them in a family, all of their own, lithium, sodium, and potassium. And then he went on and on trying to see what other patterns he could establish.
Mendeleev wanted to find out if these different families fitted together in one grand, all-inclusive pattern. One night, in a dream, he had a revelation. He'd found it. He displayed his cards in an order that accounted for all the properties of the 63 known elements. But what he alone realized was that there were elements missing. So he left gaps in his pattern. Mendeleev predicted there must be other elements, as yet unknown.
Then, as if by magic, gallium was discovered in 1875. Scandium was discovered in 1879. And germanium was discovered in 1886. Starovia! Superb justification for Mendeleev's theories. He'd invented the periodic table.
Scientists were spurred into searching for more elements, filling up the gaps. And with his periodic table, chemistry has gone from strength to strength. We now know of more than 100 elements.
Suddenly, it was no longer magic. Magic had been replaced by rules of science.
While Victorian scientists were uncovering rules in chemistry and nature, engineers were on a different mission. They were creating rules. Sir Joseph Whitworth, an engineer from Manchester, had a vision that the industrial world would work better if things were standardised. So he set about creating rules of precision that we take for granted today.
Now, just look at this. It may not look very exciting, but this is the world standard flat surface, as first made by Joseph Whitworth about 1840. It's absolutely exactly flat. And without that, you simply couldn't have any precision engineering. The point is, they were building railways and bridges and all sorts of things, and they needed precision engineering.
Without reference standards like Whitworth's flat surface, engineers would not have been able to create the modern industrial world. Mass production of components underpinned the manufacturing industries. All kinds of goods were made to the same common standards, from typewriters to sewing machines, from bicycles to firearms.
On the 2nd of July 1860, Queen Victoria fired the opening shot in the first National Rifle Association prize meeting at Wimbledon. She aimed at an iron target 400 yards away, hit it with a satisfying clang. The bullet made a wonderful dent. She'd hit the bullseye. She was delighted. But of course, nothing had been left to chance. Queen Victoria's rifle was clamped into this very rest, absolutely massive thing. It weighs 125 kilograms. Look at these huge great balls holding it down, absolutely steady.
The rest was designed to hold the rifle exactly in position, so that a bullseye was inevitable, regardless of who pulled the trigger.
But it wasn't only the rest that was extraordinary, it was the rifle. In 1860, this was the most accurate weapon in the world.
It was designed by our old friend, Joseph Whitworth.
Now, what's so special about this Whitworth rifle?
The Whitworth was the first rifle to accurately define the relationship between the weight of the bullet, the diameter of the bullet, and the rate of spin. The spin is necessary to keep the bullet flying in the same direction as the trajectory.
Now, the barrels have a hexagonal bore, and the bullet is hexagonal
Yes.
too, in a peculiar way.
Designed to fit the spiral and follow the spiral, and the spiral was turn in 20 inches.
One turn in 20, so about 2 whole turns in the length of the barrel,
About
something
that,
like
yes.
that, yes.
He finally came up with this rifle which was capable of putting a bullet into the same target area that the 1853 model rifle hit at 600 yards. He could do it at 1,400 yards.
So it was 3 times as
Nearly
accurate.
3 times as much.
That
yes.
is amazing.
So when Queen Victoria pulled the silk cord attached to the rifle trigger, a bullseye was guaranteed.
1, 2, 3. As far as standards and accuracy were concerned, one place was king. Nowhere in the whole world had more influence in the 19th century than the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, which is just up at the top of this hill.
The observatory was set up in 1674 to try to solve some of the navigational problems faced by the Navy. In Victorian times, it was also the place where sailors set their ships' clocks.
Since 1833, that big ball up there on the weather vane has been what all the ship's captains in the Thames have used to check their watches or chronometers before they set sail. This was actually the very beginning of standard time distribution from Greenwich. These days, of course, we get pips on the radio. But what I want to do is to check my smart watch here against that ball. When it drops, it's exactly 1 o'clock. There, I reckon I'm 40 seconds fast. Or maybe the ball's 40 seconds slow. No, of course it can't be, because that is Greenwich Mean Time, or rather British Summer Time. As far as time goes, Greenwich rules.
The time ball was a good idea, but it couldn't be seen by everyone. So in 1836, the observatory began to distribute its time across London. The Greenwich time lady, Miss Ruth Belville, would set a pocket chronometer to Greenwich time and travel down the steep hill into London, taking the correct time to clock shops. The whole of the city had its watches set to Greenwich time. So in the 1840s, when time across Britain became standardised to accommodate railway timetables, it was Greenwich time that was adopted. In the 1850s, timekeeping became more accurate than ever before, thanks to a combination of science and precision engineering. Astronomers knew that the most accurate timekeepers were the stars. In 1854, a new telescope was built to log their movements more precisely than ever before. This is the Transit Circle, commissioned by Astronomer Royal George Biddle Airy.
You'd look through here where the crosshairs of the line are.
Right.
And while waiting for the star to come into view, you'd simply tap on here.
Ah, and so you don't have to look away.
You don't have to look away.
Fantastic.
It records
Okay, so I look through
particularly
here,
the time.
and I'm waiting for the dog star to appear, and it's coming up to the crosshairs. Now! Fantastic.
It's all about eliminating error and making whoever's using the telescope for these observations, eliminating the error and making it as standardised as possible.
It's very clever, because you could certainly be accurate to a second, if not better.
Wait, tenths and probably less.
Yeah, fantastic.
It was made by Ransom and Sims, who at the time were very famous for agricultural machinery
and lawnmowers.
And lawnmowers, indeed.
Terrific.
But what Airy was doing was bringing together, unifying these great opticians, engineers, clockmakers. He was bringing them all together, taking the best from each area that he needed.
George Airy's telescope came to play a huge part in defining the way the world is viewed in a rather unexpected way.
Greenwich bills itself as the centre of space and time. Tourists come here from all over the world to stand astride a quintessentially Victorian invention. Look, this is it, the meridian line. So this is the eastern hemisphere, and this is the western hemisphere. East is east, west is west, Greenwich is where I love the best.
In 1884, an international group of delegates declared that Greenwich should be home to 0 degrees, the prime meridian, the line on the Earth's surface from which all other lines of longitude would be measured. And the exact path taken by this line was defined by the very crosshairs of George Airy's telescope.
George Airy's telescope was the ultimate in Victorian high-precision engineering. It defined the meridian line, and in this way the Victorians were laying down standards for the whole world.
In the next programme, I'll be investigating the most lurid 19th century crimes and discovering how the Victorians punished their hard-bitten criminals. Meanwhile, if you'd like to find out more about the Victorians, there's loads to discover on the BBC History website.
For 4 weeks, these people have been counting calories, following a strict diet and keeping an eye on their weight, in a bid to make themselves fatter.
Individuals have a biology that determines how skinny or fat they will be, and wishing it one way or the other really can't change it.
As the world gets wider, science asks, why don't thin people get fat? Horizon, coming soon to BBC Two.
Activate child rescue alert.
Have a reputation for treading on toes.
Nice to have you back. It's another boy on a white background.
Sent to the BBC, ITV, the papers.
Do you want every Looney Tunes kidnapping someone so that they can get their calls on the telly?
Have you got a better idea?
You're quite smart sometimes, aren't you? Not overly, not too much.
We're looking for anything that links these two boys.
I wanted it to be you!
I need to buy us time.
Go home.
Gamble, get us a fix, come on.
Sacred. What's that about?
Together, they're the perfect couple. Hunter, Sunday at 9 on BBC One.
The Thursday Newsnight, now BBC Two with Gavin Esler.